Okay, just so everybody knows who's on the line, I actually did push record this go around, so we ought to be good. Assuming it all works like it's supposed to, I'll post it. Okay, it would appear that there's some aspect of the quiz for chapter 3 that is in another chapter, whether it's chapter 2, chapter 4, I don't know. But it would appear that somehow or other those questions have been loaded incorrectly, which means that I will eventually get back to the notion of giving everybody full credit for the quiz. And basically, from a point perspective, no harm, no foul. I'll have to figure out what went goofy with that later. No worries. Whoever it was who told me about it, thanks. Anything lingering from the other day? What I do know, just from looking, is that the longer we go, this is what? This is chapter 4, so this is the 4th week. Some of you are already tired. Some of you have already opted for the online version, which some people would find very interesting. I find it more curious than interesting. Anyway, do with that information what you will. It's easier for you to work that way. Happy for you to do that. So if there's nothing lingering from the other day, then let's take a look at perception. Basically how it is we deal with the world that we live in, how it is we perceive things. Some point in time, some people might even consider the notion of what is real versus what is not real necessarily. Now, what's so very paradoxical about the notion of perception is that what seems so very easy for those of us who quote unquote perceive things becomes much more difficult for psychologists or other scientists to understand or explain, much less to the word they use is operationalize, meaning that it becomes very difficult to articulate whatever that thing is in a way that we can measure it. How does a person measure one's anger? Typically, the only way you do that is by using what's called a Likert scale, the scale of measurement from 0 to however many. And on a scale of typically something like 1 to 7, you estimate the level of your agitation or your anger, with 0 being, oh, I'm not angry about anything, to number 7, I think I'll kill somebody now, or whatever the designations are for each one of those numbers. So you're trying to measure something that you cannot always hold and manipulate necessarily, certainly not very well. So for us to be able to deal with those things on a consistent basis, much less as human creatures, those systems are extremely complicated and how we go about processing the information. Now, the first one of those approaches is what's noted as the ecological approach, meaning that we deal with clues that are most often received from the environment directly, without any sort of interference, without any sort of extra interpretation. The question over here would be, how many of you in this room are chilly, as in cold? 2 or 3. Walk in the door had been shut. I don't know if they had class beforehand or not. It was cooler than normal. Now, I didn't have to interpret it per se. Did I think about it a little bit later? Yes. But my body automatically sensed that it was cooler. I didn't have to say, oh, what my body is sensing at the moment is a refrigerator where you can hang meat. No, wasn't like that. It's just, oh, it's cold, and went on about my business. Other senses that other things that we might perceive that we don't always interpret. We don't interpret light necessarily. Had you walked in, at least in this room, and the room was dark, and I made you sit in the dark for a certain amount of time, then the question would have been, are you going to turn on the lights? Well, you wouldn't have thought too much about it until I turned them on. Or if you'd walked in and you never thought about the fact that the light was going to be on, or you didn't assume, so you did. If you did assume, you just would have assumed that the light's going to be on and all is well. We don't think about those things necessarily. That's the ecological approach. We experience those things from the environment without providing an actual interpretation all the time. Now, constructivists will argue that perception, the system of perception, is something that we make a reality of because of bits of sensory information. In other words, we construct our perception. What's real? What's not real? What are we perceiving as real? What those of us perceive as desks or tables, we perceive them as solid things. In reality, they are not. In reality, they are made of molecules that have been compacted together, but in between each one of those molecules, there is still measurable space. So the object we perceive as solid or whole is really not. Again, it may sound a little odd, but those who deal with perception on that level construct, they build the things that they deal with related to reality. And the computationalists believe that neural activity transforms our sensory stimulation into the experience of our reality. In all fairness, it's probably a combination of all of those things. You'll find very few things in science that are very black or white. You'll find most things, certainly as we perceive them, tend to be some aspect of one or the other. There we go. Let's see, where'd I go? Lost my thought. I'll come back around to that. So let's look at psychophysics. It's the study of the relationship between physical energy that comes from the environment and the psychological experience of that energy. The world is comprised of energy. You cannot create any more. You cannot destroy it. It is simply a part of what we constitute as reality. Now, part of all that is what we do with it, as well as the physics related to it. Now, there is what's called an absolute threshold, meaning that certain things we experience in reality have to reach a certain level of amplitude, or in some cases, loudness, for us to perceive they are there. That makes sense? You don't always hear every sound that your body is encountering. It only, when it reaches a certain threshold or a certain volume level, does your body perceive that as energy. So the absolute threshold is the minimum amount of energy that can be detected half of the time. Stimuli that fall below that threshold are usually not detected, and they're referred to as subliminal, meaning that they're there, but we don't always perceive them. Stimuli detected because they're above that threshold are called supraliminal. Now, if you talk about subliminal experience, let's ask this question. What am I asking you to believe? In the plainest language I know, when I use that sort of idea, what I'm trying to explain to you is that there are some things your brain consciously processes as information, as in noise, for the example, and there are other things that are technically noise that your body does not perceive. Go back to the question I asked last time, or the time before that, whichever it was. If a tree falls in the woods, does it make a noise? Short language is no, it makes sound waves. Unless there is something there to take that sensory information and process it, it's just a sound wave. Only when something is there that can hear it. So if you can't hear it, it's at what we call a subliminal level. ESP falls into this category, extrasensory perception. Some people can, quote unquote, perceive things at a level that other people cannot. It's where you get all of the ideas related to the, all the movies with, just a second, all the characters who have all the mutants. Y'all help me. X-Men, thank you. Well, I heard part of that. So for that, for the just noticeable difference threshold, I didn't have it quite loud enough to make it out. It took me a second. So the stimulus, the things that we can manipulate, extrasensory perception, all those characters in those movies have all kinds of extra skills. People can burn up stuff with their eyes. They can bend over spoons and whatever else they want to do. Touch things and freeze them, whatever. those skills and the way those individuals perceive reality. Of course, it's false because it's made up in a movie, but the way they portray it is that they experience all of those things, which is why some of them don't touch other people. That sort of idea. So what I'm asking you to do is to believe something that is, quote, real, even though you cannot perceive that it is there. There is information, there is research data that supports such an idea. But the challenge will be how it is you can interpret the evidence. Sometimes we explain differences in evidence related to subliminal stimuli is based on the research supporting the idea that people have reported it. Oh, I have experienced X, Y, or Z. Another possibility is the positive expectation of the stimulus. How many of you have ever listened to a self-help tape of some kind? Listen to this tape and feel better about your life. Do these 3 things and win yourself a significant other or whatever. I listen to all kinds of interesting things on from my phone or whatever else when I drive. A lot of that has to do with not only about positive perception, but it has to do with things like how life or how I can perceive my life as better. What do I think about what I encounter? What I think about the things I encounter determines their reality for me. Now, where that becomes a little goofy, I could think in this classroom, I could think about the fact that all of y'all are really not here, that y'all are all invisible and I cannot see you. That's bogus. I can't do that. I may be good at some of the things I do, but I can't whip that up out of my mind and make you disappear. Some of you might wish that I could disappear. I don't know, but it doesn't work that way. The idea is that how we think about those things. What happens when you get angry? You don't want to be around whoever it is you're angry with or the circumstance you're angry about. So what do? You change your location. You move, not as in pack up and move, but you change your location. I don't want to be around my wife because she's irritating me. I go somewhere else. I'll say that kind of crap out loud. It's real. And she would do the same thing if she's irritated with me about something. She doesn't talk. Okay. I can live with that. Sometimes that's the way reality is when you're encountering more than one person. The same thing would have occurred with my children when they lived at home. I don't want to talk to you. I don't. I can't speak with you right now because looking at you pisses me off or whatever. So you do something different. You change that perception. You alter what you think about it. And what we'll discover when we study things like social psychology and other things related to socialization and things like that is that there are a number of things that influence how it is we perceive other things and other people. As an example, and we'll get to this far later, we don't typically hang out with people we think are ugly. Now, the challenge with that is that not everybody views the notion of ugly the same way. So what one person thinks is ugly, somebody else thinks is quite beautiful, and vice versa. Or some people, or everybody, we all know about the pretty people, the beautiful people, that group of folks that we always know is going to be at their best, blah, 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 blah. And many of us despise such folks because they're always on, as it were. So we don't spend as much, our perception of them is less than. Kind of like, I don't know if wherever it is you live, whether it's in Wichita Falls or Vernon or, I live in a very small rural community down the road away. We don't maintain our city streets real well. And as a result of that, we've got lots of street issues. We haven't dealt with that situation in such a long time that we cannot afford in any way to do what's necessary to make it any better. So what happens? It continues to degrade instead of being able to be facilitated toward better in some other way. The city can't go borrow enough money to fix all the cities because we'd have to redo all the infrastructure. You see, we're in this pit. We're in a hole that we can't dig ourselves out of at a community-wide level. Now, my perception of that is that I get really agitated when I'm driving down my street and I hit a hole that would literally shake your teeth when you hit it if I'm going too fast. I can be really upset about that, or I can drive around it. Well, I can choose. My perception of that particular reality is that I'm either going to get really pissed off when I drive through this hole, or I can drive around it and not be angry at all. Or I can still be agitated because I had to swerve out of the way to miss the hole. Or maybe the hole changes. That hole gets filled up. Somebody came along with a shovel full of asphalt or something and fills that hole up, but then another one opens up. So now I'm accustomed to swerving one way to miss one hole. That hole's fixed, so I don't swerve, but I hit another hole. My perception of the holes in my street changes because the holes change. Now, I know that sounds kind of silly, but until you've driven in a place where there's a hole every 5 feet, that may not make a lot of sense to you. And the frustration you might experience of that reality might not be a big deal. But how we manage those things we experience becomes extremely important. What you think about them will influence how you feel about them. Go back to my ugly person. Okay, we don't typically hang out with people we think are ugly, which means that we normally, if that theory is correct, we like them less. We're not as interested in that person's company. We're not interested in hanging out with ugly people. We also, from a sensory perspective, as well as perception, tend to gravitate to people we think are like ourselves. We hang out with people like us. Now, at first, it may not make a whole lot of sense, but that's if you think about the list of people you hang out with, making the assumption that you hang out with other people. I'm going to assume that you do to some degree. Think about them for a moment. You will discover that they are in many ways very similar to you. Something about you is not that you have things in common, but that you are somewhat alike in some way or other. And part of that process is related to what we call signal detection theory. It's a mathematical model of stuff. It boils down to what people determine as perception as a noise, for example, or a noise plus something else is related to our sensitivity to some object or some stimulus. Are you sensitive to hot or to cold, any more or less than the other person? How is it that someone's perception of certain stimuli can change? For a good friend has a son who's autistic. First time I ever met him, he was naked as the day he was born. He was 4. Running through his house without a stitch of clothes. Somebody coming in or going out. But didn't have a stitch of clothes on. Now, because of his autism, his experience, his perception of his world was very different than what you and I would have thought to be normal. He took cold showers, didn't like hot water on his skin. He would play with his mother's worn out pantyhose because it felt good on his skin in comparison to not playing with the pantyhose. Now, his perception of how those things are and how you would have perceived them, and y'all want to sign up for a quote cold shower? Not normally. Certainly not on purpose. But he didn't want any hot water. Like as in, don't turn it on, we'll take the cold tap things. When he did wear clothes, he wore a pair of rain boots and a pair of shorts and a tank top. That's all. 15 degrees outside, didn't matter. Austin had on a tank top, a pair of shorts, and a pair of rain boots, if he had on his clothes. Did he leave the house without his clothes? No, he always had clothes on when he left the house, but it wasn't required to wear them at home. So if he didn't want to wear his clothes, he didn't wear his clothes. His perception of how those things felt was different than how you and I perceive those things. So I could ask you now, are your clothes irritating your skin at the moment? Most of you are going to say, no. But if I start pushing on it a little bit, are you sure you're not irritated behind your left shoulder bone or something? And some of you are going to get an itch because your perception of the stimulus that's really not there suggests that there's an itch there. It's how we perceive those things, our sensitivity. The notion of signal detection theory is also related to a person's ability to detect the stimulus based on how we respond to it. If you expect a stimulus to be present, then your response to that stimulus is going to be a little lower. In other words, you don't have to have as big a stimulus to experience it if you're expecting it. If you're not expecting hot weather, it's going to require some hot weather to get your attention. If you know that in the middle of the summertime it's going to be 100 degrees, you don't care about the fact that it's 100 degrees, because that's what happens in North Texas in the summertime. Living in Montana, if it gets to 90 degrees in the summertime, people are going to be wigging out. They don't function well when the temperature gets above 80, 85, even in the summertime. That is terribly hot for them. Those of us who grew up in the South, where it's normal for temperatures to be 100 or above, laugh at them. Why are you so uptight about that? It's 90 degrees. Oh my God, it's 90, we're gonna die. No, you really won't. I promise, you really won't. And the same thing works in reverse. People who live in the South are not always accustomed to minus 25 degrees in Montana either in the wintertime. So when you walk outside and it's 25 degrees below zero, the person who grew up in the South says, you know what, it's freaking cold out here. Those who live there when it's minus 25, they get up out of bed and go to work just like normal. They don't even think about not having school till it gets 25 below zero. They might have a conversation about it. 2 feet of snow on the ground, no worries, bus runs. Get your butt up, go to school. That's normal for them. It would not be normal for those of us in the South. So how we perceive those things, what we expect, what we don't expect, the expectation of a stimulus, as those things increase, the amount of stimulus energy necessary lowers. So signal detection theory has led us to be much more accurate about the instrumentation we use and how we measure those things, how we deal with signal detection, all kinds of fun stuff. So is it easy to judge differences in certain types of signals? I mentioned that just noticeable difference, which is the minimum detectable difference between two stimuli, the difference threshold, will depend on the amount of the energy that's first initiated. A law called Weber's law says that the just noticeable difference is a fixed proportion of the intensity of a stimulus. There's a mathematical equation for it if you're interested in that sort of stuff. But then we end up trying to define how intense is that stimulus. Do you need something to experience pain? Do you need something that's rated number 1 on a scale of 1 to 10 or number 10 on the scale of 1 to 10 for it to, quote, hurt? If I polled the room, I'd get, in this room, I'd get 8 different answers. Throw me in the mix, that makes another, make it 9. What I perceive as painful, some of you may not perceive as painful at all, vice versa. Certain types of pain located on certain parts of your body feels different. You hit somebody in the arm, it feels one way. You cut off the tip of one of your fingers and it feels different. The amount of energy that's necessary, how we experience those changes in stimuli. So how do we organize all that stuff? I know it's not, it may sound like rocket science and it's really not. But what we end up doing is that we organize our perception in various and sundry ways. First thing we often do is what's called figure ground organizing. We try to assign some stimulus to the foreground. In other words, how many of you, when you're dealing with a project on your computer and you have to move, you have layers of something, and you have to bring something to the front or push something to the back so other parts of your screen didn't light up? Does that make sense to you? Am I looking, y'all, some of y'all are like, yeah, whatever. The same sort of idea. When we're dealing with our eyesight, we move things forward in our peripheral, in our vision field, and in other cases, we move things to the back. You can look, depending on one's perception, depending on the picture, and something at the front of a picture will look very different than the same article looks at a distance in the picture. There may be some pictures in your book that show a tree at the front and a tree at the back. They will look different. In reality, they're the same size. But because of the way it's drawn on the picture or on the page, the perception of the one at the back is that it's smaller. In reality, you bring them side by side, they'll be the same size. The same thing with hallways. In one of our other textbooks, there was a picture of some gorilla or something that was up front running through a brick passageway. So the gorilla is up on the front. There's a gorilla at the back, but the hallway narrows as you're looking at it. to give you the perception of depth going away. The gorilla is the same in each picture, but it looks smaller in the picture that's behind. Same works in reverse. When you bring something to the front, something then will appear smaller or larger. If we're not using that sort of foreground organizing, we're often putting things in groups. And the principles related to seeing things in groups will revolve around proximity, similarity, continuity, closure. There's probably a picture or two in your book about, you'll see, I need to pull one up, but I can't on the fly. You'll see certain pictures and they'll have gaps in the perimeter of the picture. Now, when you're looking at it, you don't think that much about it. You see the circle or you see the square. If you look real closely at the square or the circle, there are intentional gaps in the line. Your mind fills in those things for you because that's what's consistent with that particular picture. We do it with all kinds of geometrical shapes all the time. The likelihood says that we will tend to perceive objects in the way that experience tells us is the most likely arrangement. What appears to be a square is probably a square. What appears to be a square is likely not a circle. You ever look at those geometrical drawings where it says, how many triangles are here? And you'll get, somebody will say 3. Somebody else will say 112 or whatever. There's actually an answer. You just have to spend enough time counting whatever it is you're trying to count to get all of them. Now that's different. How many of you see stuff on Facebook when it says they give you all these math, this plus this equals this, and underneath that one it says this plus this equals that, this plus this equals therefore, and they ask you this plus this equals what? And you have to figure out the pattern so that you get a number at the end. You get, somebody will say, well, that adds up to, you do this and you end up at 3, or the answer is 34, or the answer is 112, or the answer is whatever. Which one of those is right? One of them right. Now, that's not the same as the perception of geometrical, when we're looking at figures per se, with something with the mathematical sort of application. You're applying a specific series of numbers to reach a certain conclusion. That's not the same. So how we perceive those things can be very different. How we sense things related to our hearing. I've told you before, I don't hear things the way everybody else does and vice versa. Some things to me are extremely loud, some other things are not so loud. A lot of that will depend on how loud the recording was made when it was put onto the, whatever it is I'm listening to. You ever hear things in 2 places at the same time? The same sound, but you're perceiving that it's coming from 2 different places. I haven't typically done that, but the other day, I was in one room of my house and our ceiling fan was making a particular racket, which was unusual. So first off, the fact that it was making noise had my attention. All right, then I asked Rebecca about that, and her response was, it's the ceiling fan. I said, no, I'm hearing it over here. And she laughed at me. The ceiling fan had been in the same place for 20 years in this house. But I was hearing the ceiling fan over here, and she cracked up. She said, no, it's the ceiling fan making noise. I said, no, it's coming from over here. No, it's really just the ceiling fan. And then I stopped what I was doing and stood up and changed my position in the room, and it's coming from the ceiling fan. I did not perceive it as from somewhere else anymore. Now, I knew in my mind's eye the noise should be coming from the ceiling fan, but I was hearing it from a place where there is no ceiling fan. Now, that does not mean that I had smoked too much dope that day. That's about how it was I was perceiving those things at that particular moment. It's about our location facilities, where things come from. I ask a question in clinical interviews all the time. Do you hear or see things other people don't? Now, I know what I mean by that question, but the answers I get can be very different depending on who's answering. I hear people tell me a lot of times I see shadows out of the corner of my eye. Now, my challenge at that point is that person experiencing some sort of psychosis or not? Are they really seeing something? Or have they moved their head quickly enough in such a fashion that it appears they have seen something? A lot of it would depend on what the object is they think they see. Do they see a ginormous rat walking down against the wall on that side of the room? Then I might ask, do you have cats at your house? And if they have cats, then I probably dismiss the big rat because they have just misperceived it. If they don't have any pets at their house and they see a big rat walking down the side of the room, I'm going to spend a little more time with that. Tell me, when did you see that? Was it at night? Was it in the daytime? Had you been smoking dope? Had you done methamphetamine that day? Had you done this? Had you done that? Had you had too much to eat? Not enough to eat? Are you tired? Are your children screaming? Whatever. You start asking all these other sorts of questions to get a better understanding of what those people perceive. Is it a psychotic sort of episode? It might very well be. But all of us, if I polled either room, all of us would say that we have seen things out of the corner of our eyes before that we know dang good and well is not there. We flip our head quickly enough and we wait for our brain cells to catch up with where we've moved our eyes and we think we saw something. No, it's not there. Part of that's related to the location of how we perceive things. Our depth perception goes back to what I was mentioning a while ago. The size of things related to its height or its width, linear perspective, color, all those sorts of things change. And as a result of those changes, or how it is that we perceive them as individuals, they appear different in some way or other. I may have asked this before. Anybody colorblind? You live in that place of all blacks and grays and whites? Good for you. I don't know what I would think about life if it was simply gray. Talk about a drag. You know, I'll look different depending on what type of color I'm wearing. So do you. Certain types of clothing will influence the color of your eyes. There's a piece of my watch that, depending on what I'm wearing, looks very, very blue or very, very purple. The piece does not change. It's exactly the same every time. But depending on what I wear, it may look more purple than blue. The first time it had been repaired, and the first time I held it in my hand after it had been repaired, my first thought was, is this purple or is this blue? And the jeweler said, it's blue. Okay, I'll take your word for it. Those of you who have blue eyes, your eyes will be more blue depending on what shade of blue you might be wearing or not. Same would occur with any other color. My newborn grandson, we can't tell what color his eyes are. To me, they look black. They haven't shifted into a specific color. They end up being this real dark hazel color. Now, is that brown? Or is it a very interesting shade of green? I don't know. So I don't worry about that. They're trying to figure out what color his eyes are. I've moved on to something else because I can't figure that part out. You know, parents are going to spend time trying to figure out what their child's eyes are. What color is that? Beats the heck out of me. Couldn't tell you. Part of that's about how we accommodate the sensory information we receive. I want you to be aware, we're winding down a little early today, but be aware that your brain decides what is moving by evaluating the movement cues that your retina picks up. Your retina picks up information. Now, before it got to your retina, it's been through 2 or 3 other layers of stuff related to your eyeball, don't forget. But how you perceive that piece of information is based on something happening on the retina. Now, I'm going to date myself here because I haven't been to what I would call a beer joint. I've been to places, big restaurants and stuff like that, where people drink and carry on. Yes, but I haven't been to what I would call a bar where people go to dance or whatever else. I don't even know if they do that anymore. But way back in the day, they had different sorts of colored lights or whatever stuff that flashed all the time. And if you had a little bit too much to drink, all that flashing make you a little woozy. Even if you hadn't been drinking. You've known people who have seizures related to to light stimuli, stimulation of certain types of light flashing will trigger seizures in some people. That's how they provoke seizures when they're trying to test someone to see if they have them. So how we perceive that sort of stuff is called stroboscopic motion. The strobe light, as it were. When we perceive movement, everything appears to slow down if you're under a strobe. It's how we deal with things in movies, how our brains process information that we receive in video, films, things like that. Stuff related to perception, as well as its size and shape. How big is it? How small is it? What's it shaped like? I knew it years ago. I mean, a long time ago, in a place far, far away. I heard this story from a young lady she was sleeping on a bunk bed in a little bitty one-room apartment thing, sharing this place with this other girl. And I don't remember if they'd been drinking or what, but one of them rolled over in the middle of the night and saw a shadow on the window. The shade was pulled down, but the way the light had been shining on it, it appeared to be somebody standing outside the window. And they were really concerned about that, to the point that they were having a small discussion with themselves about what they were going to do if somebody came in the room. Well, there was a set of golf clubs in there. Maybe we'll get one of the golf clubs and smack them on the head with a golf club. There wasn't anything there. The moon was shining across a branch of a tree that happened to be putting itself up against that window at that particular time, and it appeared that someone was standing there, but that thing never moved. So then they began to wonder, is there even anything there? Did they go outside and look? Nope, dark outside, they're not going. So they sat around and mumbled about it all night long and didn't get any more rest until they decided to go outside the next morning and see if anybody had been there. It's just a tree. But their perception of it, its shape, its brightness or darkness, as they thought about it in the middle of the night when things are dark, it appeared much more sinister than it really was. It was a tree branch. Now, surely none of you have ever misperceived things like that outside your door, outside your window. Ever seen things that are not there? All that kind of fun stuff, whether it has been artificially simulated or not. Your culture will also define to a great degree what you experience. I've had more than one person, persons of color, more especially than those who are Caucasian or white. I can ask them questions about hearing and seeing things other people don't. And it is not uncommon for a person of color to tell me, oh, my grandmother, she died however many years ago, comes to check on me. Okay, cool. Now, if it seems to be bothersome for that person to tell me about that, tell me some more, and I'll ask them to unpack that a little bit for me. In some cultures with people of color, it is not uncommon at all for deceased relatives, especially of the grandma-ish type, to come and check on people. It's not uncommon at all. Now, if some white person sitting in my office and tells me that their grandma who died 14 days ago or whatever is coming to check on them, we're going to have a conversation, because white people typically don't do that. Yeah, and when I say people of color, all kinds of different sorts of color. What I'm getting at is people who are not white. I'm sorry? I still can't hear you.
I said we said it in like my mom used to say that she told her dad.
Yeah, and part of that's also related to age. Older individuals in certain cultures, experience things differently than other people.
I don't experience that. After my grandmother, she liked the red cardinals, the birds, and so after she passed away, we'd see them more often. So we thought, that would be like her, checking in, but never like talking, getting the vibe of somebody talking to you that's your dad that reminded you of like a grandmother. I never experienced. I feel really crazy if that ever happened to me.
Okay, see, and other folks would think that was just as normal as walking down the street. And others of you are saying, this guy has lost his mind. I'm telling you, people perceive things in life very differently. It can be fascinating to have conversation with people, to really get a better feel. Are they experiencing something for that person? Is that real for them? Or is it some illusion that they have made up for themselves? How many of you buy a certain color car or end up in a certain color car and you see that color car on every street corner after that? You become much more sensitive to the color of your car. Has the number of that color car been any more or less? No, you've just noticed it more. If my relatives came to visit me in the middle of the night and to wake me up and to tell me about some impending doom, once I got over the fact that I was laughing, I would, no, I'm not anticipating that to happen in my house. And because I'm not anticipating something like that, the likelihood of it coming is very thin. Because then, of course, I'd want to know what it was. Why are you telling me this? Why do I need to know? If I'm going to have a conversation, I'm going to have a conversation. If you're going to wake me up in the middle of the night, and you were my grandma who's been dead for 20 years, we're going to talk. If you're going to bother me, we are going to have a conversation. What is it that you freaking want in the middle of the night? If my mother was to come back and visit, I'd tell you she's pissed off about something. She was always pissed off when she was alive, so why wouldn't she be pissed off when she was dead? And just the way things roll. Which that also tells me that she's not ornery enough to come back. I mean, she's ornery enough to come back, but I don't think she would. She's got other stuff to do. Again, that's also about one's perception, what we think about, how we feel about those sorts of things. Any other curiosities or questions about any of that? Perception can be great fun or not, depending on what we encounter. Now, it just dawns on me. Oh, this is stuff in chapter 4. Somebody asked if I was in the right chapter or not. That's not really what they asked. They wanted to make sure I was giving them the same information. Yes, it's information out of my chapter 4. So yeah. Anyway, any other curiosities? Anything else to clean up? I made myself a note on the roll sheet. Y'all probably didn't notice. I need to put some information online for you related to a signature assignment that we're going to be doing. Y'all remind me, I'll go through that on Thursday as well. So that y'all can get on that if y'all would like to get started. It considers information that we're going to encounter later, but I can give you the information for the assignment now, so that you don't have to worry about having to press yourself for time later. Anything else today? Enjoy your day. Enjoy some sunshine. I'm sorry? You too. I hate it when I can't hear.